Hmm. Awesome. Welcome, Franco, Daphne. Good Canada. Good to see you. Awesome, everyone. Well, I know we're expecting some more folks to join, but we're going to go ahead and get started just to honor y'all's time. So really great that you've all taken the time out of your day to join us. We're really excited to be here with you all. It's nice to see some familiar faces and some new faces. And yeah, I just really appreciate you all taking the time out of your days to be with us here on Zoom for our In Rhythms introductory webinar to regenerative organizations. So as I said, my name is Alex. I'm on the In Rhythm team and I'm based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And, you know, as you all are logging in and getting oriented to Zoom, love if you could just post in the chat. Let us know where you're calling in from, your name. Also feel free to jot down if you're affiliated with an organization. It's always cool to kind of create some connection in that way. I know we've got folks from all over, which is kind of awesome. Chile, Belgium, we've got Liverpool, Colorado, Massachusetts. So yeah, just thank you for being here. We really appreciate it. For those of you who aren't familiar with In Rhythm, we're a management and design consultancy that focuses on revealing potential in people and organizations. And Trey Cates, our founder, is here with us today. He's going to be kicking off the presentation shortly and sharing more about In Rhythm and really our approach to managing and designing our organizations in this regenerative way. So a couple things, little logistics. We'd like to make this webinar really as engaging as possible. So love if you would make use of the chat feature. Trey's probably going to call out questions here and there throughout the presentation. So feel free to just kind of respond in that way. Love to kind of hear your thoughts as we go through this together.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Sorry, everyone. It looks like Zoom kicked me off. Classic. I don't know what happened, but we are back. And yeah, I think I was just saying, you know, logistics, this will be recorded. So if you're not able to join us for the whole thing or you want to share it out afterwards, please feel free to do that. We'll be sharing this with you afterwards. And yeah, without further ado, Trey, I think I'll hand it over to you, hopefully with no more technical difficulties. And I'll also share my screen in a moment.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Welcome. We're super excited about you being here. As some of you may know that are familiar with the work that In Rhythm does, we see this as a true expression of our own passions and deep commitment to seeing the world in a very, very regenerative way, something that we can do that increases the potential for individuals, for the communities that they're a part of, and the ongoing work that everyone is doing in the world. So we're excited about how we can play a part in supporting those efforts. Again, as Alex said, Trey from In Rhythm as a founder of the organization, based currently in Hot Springs, Arkansas, but playing a lot of time between Hot Springs and Boulder, Colorado, is where I'm based. So in terms of expectations today, in terms of the webinar, we're going to cover really three main things and then have room for discussion. The first is kind of the state of what organizations are today. And it really helps us to ground it into their current design as a means to be able to say, well, what is it that we want to change? We then will introduce a new metaphor for organizations, and then In Rhythm's design approach in terms of how you could put it to work in the context of your own life, the teams that you may be on or leading, or the organizations that you're a part of. And then just leave room open for discussion as a way for us to, talk with one another about maybe experiences that you're having that are worth calling out, or aspirations that you believe in that we can support. So with that in mind, I want to ask this and start with this question. What is the most dominant metaphor used to describe organizations today? And feel free to drop your comments in a chat, or feel free to unmute and say, here's what I think the most dominant metaphor is. organism, sustainable, a fleet, living organism. Love it. Awesome. Great. So there are now regenerative. Love collaborative. Wonderful. Yeah, so those are, some of you are already on a pathway towards seeing organizations very differently than what would be the most dominant metaphor. And when we think of dominant, just think about how most organizations or individuals may approach the design and the ongoing view of the organization. And as we see on the screen here, even governments see themselves as machines, businesses as machines. And so they're really the most dominant metaphor, and it has been the most dominant metaphor for a couple of centuries. And it really was influenced by the industrialized revolution, is this idea of a machine. And if the machine is the dominant metaphor, it starts to say something about our teams, and it starts to say something about the people on those teams. And we'll hold that a little loosely as we dive into it. But that metaphor continues to influence everything we do, everything that we say. And so in particular, when you think about what that does, I want you to even think about, organizations that are thinking about change management. There's this great example of principle number 4 that was used on a social media post and actually a part of a design course, where they saw change management as options and measures and strategy and improve this and execute on this and team this, all through COGS as a way to improve the organization. But what was interesting, and you'll notice this in the comment here in the slide, is that they, because of this, saw employees as a perishable commodity. Now, I don't know about you, but if we start seeing, as we have been, and continue to see people as perishable commodities, it really influences our design. But it doesn't just stop there. It's not the organization. We've seen this throughout history by seeing the human body as a machine, where the arms are levers, the pumps are the lungs, the brain is a bunch of processing that's going on, all of that. And you even see memes on the internet or on social where you hit the reset button when you're talking about your brain, right? Or the cogs or the wheels that are moving in your mind, right? Or that we need to plug something in to increase our brain power, right? All of these are examples of how we continue to double down on the machine metaphor. And actually, a really famous founder of Bridgewater Associates, Ray Dalio, actually wrote this: think of yourself as a machine operating within a machine, and know that you have the ability to alter your machines to produce better outcomes. And we are actually going to ask the question, which is, so what are the unintended consequences of that kind of approach? What happens when we see machines and humans as parts of machines? Dehumanization. Perfect. What else? Anything else that comes to mind? Repair. Yeah. Mechanistic mindset, breakdowns. Yes, we lose systems thinking. Sure. Loss of connection to self and others. All of this is wonderful. That's actually so true. And the fact of the matter is, for all of us, as we begin to recognize that this kind of metaphor influences not only our thinking, but our design and our behavior. And so the last comment was made was that, yeah, we're replaceable. And there's none of us. Humans in general have so much creativity and uniqueness and genuineness to bring to a context. And for us to be just seen as replaceable parts or commoditized tools is absolutely a disservice to humanity and a disservice to our future potential. So when we think about this, though, what we want to do is recognize it didn't land just in, dehumanizing people. It actually shows up in the planet, because we actually are living on a planet that is full of life. And when we decide to treat it as a machine, resources as a machine, and we extract, we actually lose biodiversity. And it's not just biodiversity, we lose engagement. So, you know, we see things like the index that Gallup puts out in particular that talks specifically about disengagement. And in the US alone, it actually goes as far as to say that we're losing $450 to $550 billion a year in lost productivity because of disengagement. And the question is why? Why is there disengagement? Well, with that metaphor and the consequence of that kind of metaphor being put into practice, I can't imagine that our disengagement wouldn't be higher because we are treating people in a way that is going to do nothing but devalue them and disengage them and actually reduce their potential and the potential of the systems that they're a part of. In addition to that, we see that in new generations. You know, new generations are saying, like millennials, hey, listen, they're the most disengaged group right now, but they're also the ones most likely to engage in passion projects and be engaged in ways that will release their potential because they don't want to be just put to work in a commoditized way. And we also know the financial system is broken as a result of this design. It does not serve us for a few people in the world to represent the entire wealth of nations. And what can we do to actually rethink that? We just did a webinar not too long ago with John Fullerton of the Capital Institute at reimagining a regenerative economy, because this kind of design is not serving us. And then next is this idea of equity. Equity was designed into our systems. And actually, I'll say inequity was designed into our systems. And so what can we do to change that and to recognize that we can't allow infant mortality and life expectancy and all those things to be influenced by race. We've got to be able to change those things and to recognize that our inequity was designed in even the US system in a way that is pretty substantial, from early laws of what it means to be white all the way to the Naturalization Act into what it meant to be a US citizen, were all designed to create inequity because there was a difference in view of who was and who wasn't deserving of that. And all of that to say is we see this as a design issue. And with that being a design issue, we recognize that this mechanistic approach was an empowering approach. It's not that it wasn't useful, it's just not useful when we're talking about living systems. Newton was an incredible thinker, and all the philosophical foundations of Western civilization and the cause and effect that disrupted some of kind of our divine and fate approach, all applied to certain complicated situations are meaningful and appropriate. But when we think about it from a complexity standpoint, even Einstein said that when the number of factors come into a phenomenological complex is too large, the scientific method fails in most cases. And so even Einstein recognized our current design, our current thinking, our current systems have not been able to adapt to complexity. So what we've got to do is to recognize there is really a big difference between what is complicated and complex. And the complicated falls into the category of those things we make, right? Things that we are able to define what the inputs are, and we can measure the steps, and then we can predict the outputs. But when we talk about what's complex or complexity, we're talking about these dense interdependencies with a nonlinear change, and it's quickly unpredictable. And so we've done a phenomenal job of showing our success, being able to send somebody to the moon, being able to see the advances in technology. But all of that was putting to work in a complicated context. But we've not made, excuse me, a lot of progress in those things that we manage. So imagine complicated are great for things we make, and complexity are things that we need to address from things we manage. And so with that being the case, our intention is to recognize that there are things that really need different ways of management. and different ways to make decisions. So let me show you a couple of slides. First slide, complicated or complex? Is this complicated or complex? Complicated, that's right, right? So it's a series of steps that we can follow to create something, right? Awesome. The next slide. This one, complicated or complex? Complex, that's right. So here, there are those interdependencies and connections, and we as a society are beginning to recognize that we need to change that. So there are organizations forming themselves around seeing them as complex systems. But we want to take it one step further. It's not just complicated or complex systems. We see them as in the middle of a major shift where it's not about the digital or millennial or Facebook age. It's really about complexity. And within complexity, we believe we should change the metaphor and the whole design paradigm, which is seeing life as a metaphor, not a machine, because we're living. And because we're living, surely nature, surely our ecosystems have something to say about how we should organize ourselves. And now, with that in mind, the first thing that may come to mind is this idea of the circle of life. And there's all kinds of incredible things, and Disney did an amazing job, helping us understand just the connection that we can have with life. But it's not really a circle of life we want to talk about. It's really a cycle of life. And in particular, we're real students of the systems view of life by Maturana and Varela at the Santiago School. And they're one of the first ones to do this holistic study on what is life. And what's interesting is they studied all the simplest form of bacteria, and they mapped the chemical, the material, the energetic pathways of all of that life. And then they began to recognize some things that came out of that. When they recreated it in that particular cell wall, it was a test tube, and discovered that the one thing they couldn't do, they couldn't repeat, was this idea of self-maintenance and self-repair. But what they discovered was the defining of it was this idea of the autopoiesis, this self-poetry or self-making. So they coined the term that all defining aspects of life need to self-maintain and self-regenerate. And so those defining unique properties in particular was, one, self-regeneration was not it was not located in any one place. Secondly, it was dependent upon all the interconnected relationships. Third, life was a holistic or emergent property of all the parts of the cell and the relationships in there, and that all the other wholes or parts of the system were autopoietic as well, the idea of wholes within wholes. And so, excuse me, so the idea became that we recognize life is an organized system capable of maintaining itself within a boundary of its own making. So we've equated living with regenerative and regenerative with living. And in essence, you can't be regenerative without it being a living system. It's the only thing. A living system is the only thing that can regenerate itself. And so with us being humans and a part of these living systems, what can we do to consider our design as a way to organize ourselves around this? And so in particular, we want us to talk about this living systems versus this machine paradigm. And in particular, the machine design, when we're applying it to a living system, we believe engineers this idea of best practices. And imagine a machine is designed to do one thing and one thing well: produce and be efficient. And your job is to continue to enhance its productivity and its efficiency. But the idea of best practices is we build a machine once and then we improve upon it, but we improve upon it so that we can do it over and over and over again. But when you apply that approach to a living system, it enforces this idea that we can come up with a prescriptive silver bullet structure or solution that allows us to replicate it and do the same thing over and over again. And unfortunately, living systems are unique. And when we take that kind of approach, we degenerate what we say is the health of that system. Now, when we take a living systems approach, really embrace us as a living, evolving, naturally functioning system, we believe that informs this idea that we all have to embrace in living systems, which is a principled approach. It opens creativity. It moves us to this idea of thinking outside of the box, right? The relatively box that we find in the machine paradigm. And we know this facilitates this idea of what we call flexible frameworks. And these flexible frameworks, we believe, with a principled approach, regenerates the health of a system. And so when we're dealing with a living system, that's what we want to do. We want principles to inform our flexibility and boundaries to be able to use that as a way to regenerate the health of the system. Now, one requires an enormous amount of energy. And what we say is external inputs. You can't run a machine without electricity. You can't run a machine without continuing to fill it up so that it will do what it needs to do. But when you think about a living system, it actually has the ability to self-maintain and self-regenerate. It actually can create its own energy. And so there's less energy required in the system. It's definitely can be a part of the system. And then what we see ourselves in Rhythm as playing a role in shifting people's mindsets, their behaviors, and their practices from that mechanistic designed system to a living system. And that's what we spend a lot of time with people doing in projects, in organizations, in collaboration, is how do you make that shift? And what can we do to support you in that shift? And there's a lot of work to be done. And there are a lot of wonderful organizations and people doing this kind of work globally. But that is the kind of work that is required of us if we're wanting to embrace this kind of complexity with a management philosophy and paradigm that allows for the kind of flexibility that will create health in the system and regenerate potential. So let me just briefly talk about a little bit about our principled approach. And so we've got 6 principles that we design around and encourage a design process around, which is this idea of holism. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So we want to see the whole system, the entirety of it, so that we can create conditions for abundance and resilience. And that means all team members, clients, and partners should all be a part of that process. It shouldn't be siloed. When we see ourselves as an ecosystem, we recognize the value and the contribution of all aspects of that ecosystem versus as though we're a company that we're running and that company is in a microcosm by themselves. Is not true. It's actually a part of something bigger than itself. And how do we recognize that and then begin to design around that? To recognize the interdependence and the inherent value of all relationships. We want to bring out that genius. We want to bring out the value of everybody and those connections. And that leads us into uniqueness, which is we actually believe in living systems. Every aspect of that system is unique, and we should be able to design around that uniqueness. And especially in social organizations, I think we have so much opportunity to do that. Unfortunately, our design has been to commoditize, not create conditions for uniqueness. And then when we think about the next one, it's this idea, which I think a lot of organizations today have had to embrace in light of COVID and just how fast, say, markets change. We want to be evolutionary, but let's talk about evolutionary in the context of allowing us to have a dynamic balance to create health in the system, not just to be more productive and more efficient. But what does it look like for us to maintain that balance in an ever-changing environmental condition so that we can create long-term systemic health that allows for long-term systemic abundance and not just abundance in the moment? It has been always a disservice for us that we have our financial markets being designed on quarterly earnings when we know the world doesn't work on 3 months out of a whole. And so the idea that we can evolve and change that design is seriously important. And that nodal, we want to embrace the idea of decentralizing and redistributing both structures and command and actually power across the system. In particular, it's important to recognize that the more nodal an organization or a social institution is, actually the more resilient it can be. It's not guaranteed, but it increases the opportunity for that if those nodes are empowered and allowed to be able to be decision makers and be resourced across the entire system. And actually, this is being recognized at a lot of Fortune 1000 companies today. And we've had a couple of recent conversations where it's a big deal to talk about resilience within these large organizations. And we actually believe a path to resilience is embracing these principles, and nodal in particular. And then the last is this idea of being developmental. And that is, we focus on the growth and health of the members of that system. And as in any ecosystem, when those members are thriving, that ecosystem can thrive. But when those members are not thriving, that ecosystem deteriorates and loses its ability to regenerate. And I believe that to be the case in many organizations today. And that is, what can we do to create the conditions for life to show up, to regenerate health and the potential, so that we can do things that I think people were designed to do things that are unimaginable. So even Buckminster Fuller, one of the most famous designers of all time, said this: work with life-centered principles and the universe pitches in to help. And that's really what we're wanting to do, is align ourselves with the energy that is really important for us to be able to then put that energy to work in a way that can be transformational to the communities we're a part of, to the relationships in our lives, and to the real work we want to do in the world. Super important to all of us. So with these living systems principles, we then want to embrace this idea of flexible frameworks. Now, when we go back to this idea of flexible frameworks, I want to go back to that lesson before that we used earlier in the conversation, which is what happens when you apply principles to complicated systems. Any ideas? What do you think happens when you apply a principle to a complicated system, not a complex one? It's a mismatch. Absolutely. What else? Limit possibilities, all the frustrating. Please, yes, thank you, Madeline. It's as though you read our slide. So yes, what we create is an enormous amount of frustration, right? And I'll use the example of what happens when you wake up on Christmas morning, you open a box or you give a present to I've got two boys, they're now older now, 25 and 23. But when they were young and they opened a box and it was all those pieces that you see there, what do you think would happen if all of a sudden there was no instructions inside? They would look to me to say, what in the world do we do with this, right? And worse off, what if it just said you need to be holistic when you pulled it together, right? Or you needed to be developmental. I can tell you that my boys at 9 and 10 years old would have not appreciated me saying, I'm going to teach you a lesson today. All they really wanted was that to be built. So it would just create frustration. And on the flip side, the same thing's true. What happens when we apply the set of instructions or best practices to complex systems? It creates frustration. And sometimes I don't think we recognize it as that, but we just keep trying to push the system to be different. And it's not. Complexity is what it is. And we need to change our management approach. And so this new kind of framework to manage complexity is to recognize that we need to move from productivity and efficiency as the primary or at times sole measures of that machine, and move into complexity, which recognizes and calls out a different way to see this kind of management. So we've got what we call the regenerative framework. And what it does is it lands itself in what we call context, which is really understand the uniqueness of that organization or that individual or that project, and to define it clearly. And then to recognize we want to create the conditions for health within that system as a means to enable that purpose. And then we design structures to enable that health, and work becomes just a natural outflow of the health of the system so that we can create the unlimited potential, the organizational resilience, and the value and wealth creation that would be systemic. So we use this framework as a means to support this kind of flexible approach around opening up the creativity, the ingenuity around people with an enormous amount of energy and intelligence and a desire to put things to work in the context of their organization or their projects in a way that would enhance the potential, but that the enhancing of the potential only comes from continuing to create the conditions for health. So we see this as a process framework, as a decision-making framework, and a design framework. It's a way for us to approach all kinds of different things, but with a different lens. So organizational productivity and efficiency are just outcomes. What we want to do is focus on the health of the system, which is how we measure living systems. And so last we want to talk about as a part, and then we'll move into conversations, is this idea of shifts and tensions. And that is, for us, we want to recognize we've got to shift. As I said before, we're going to support the shift of mindsets, behaviors, and practices. And so we're moving from best practices to principles, allowing principles to guide and increase the creativity and the freedom for decision makers. And then we're moving from prescriptions to responsive frameworks. So the idea that we've got one solution that fits everybody and it's silver bullet and it works in all cases is not true. And when we apply it that way, we actually degrade the health of the system. And what we want to do is release and enhance the health of the system, which means we need frameworks that are flexible enough to deal with that changing environment. And then we want to move from dominance to interdependence. It's not about command and control and being to dictate what people should do. It's about freeing them up and recognize the interconnectedness and how we can have cooperation and the ability to design around that as a key way to create potential in the system. And then we also want to move from this idea of predicting things. I mean, we've seen that our predictions not gone so well with things like COVID and other social challenges that we've had. It's not about prediction, it's about seeing patterns and how do we then design around them. And then to really call this out particularly, and we've been calling it out for years, just this idea that we need to move from extraction to equity. We can't extract from people. We can't extract from our natural environments and expect that the energy would be there for us to do this incredible work. So we want to focus on development of the whole, and then continuing to move from centralized to decentralized empowerment. You know, we believe intelligence exists in all people, and we need to build the capacity and work with people to resource decision-making that can exist throughout the entire organization. So for us, a regenerative organization, and its definition, it's a working definition for us, is a living, evolving, and naturally functioning organization where abundance and resilience are recurring outcomes of its underlying health. The switch, the shift in mindset is it's not a machine, it's alive. The shift in behaviors is we can't design it in a way that extracts from people. We need to create the potential through designing around health. And the practices are, it's not about silver bullet, it's about creating the opportunity for that uniqueness to show up, and that abundance and resilience comes out of the health of the system, not being forced or pushed or pulled as a part of the design process. So when we think about the work that we're doing in Rhythm's work and our approach, it's really rooted in this living systems approach. And this living system really informed by these design principles that we think come straight out of life, and that we use flexible frameworks to facilitate the process, which opens up creativity, it enhances freedom and the opportunity for more potential. And more than all of that, it actually is healthy. It is what we should be doing in our organizations, in our lives. We apply this process to, I'll speak to me, I apply it to myself as an individual, to our family, to the organizations that we're a part of, as a way to help make better decisions as a part of a living system. So we're going to end with one of the most famous quotes, and actually famous system scientists who passed away early, She said this, Danella Meadows: the world is a complex, interconnected, finite, ecological, social, psychological, economic system. We treat it as if it were not, as if it were divisible, separable, simple, and infinite. And our persistent, intractable global problems arise directly from this mismatch. And for us, it's about recognizing, hey, listen, we need to give up that machine paradigm and embrace life as a means to inform the work we're going to do in the world. And so with that, we'll start with the little time that we have left, which we have quite a bit of time. So if there's lots of conversations, we can dive into it. But we want to ask the question, what has shifted for you today? Or what has reinforced a shift that you've already experienced based on what we've talked about? And so we'll open it up. You can drop some comments in the chat field, or you can feel free to unmute.
Awesome. Thanks, Trey. I'm going to stop my share. And yeah, as Trey said, love to open it up for discussion.
Great, Madeline. Alex, would you mind reading? I couldn't get that full.
Yeah, so Madeline said, reinforced, I work in a really sick place. Thanks for sharing, Madeline. Yeah.
Thank you, Madeline. I'm sorry, and I really am saying this from a truly empathetic standpoint. We've all worked in really sick places, and so what does it look like for us to be a resource to you and others who really want to not experience that kind of sickness, right? To be released into health. And so thank you for opening up and saying that.
May I share an example, though, of hopefulness?
Yes, please.
Okay, so I work in a big academic public library, and we were actually doing a workshop. Some of you might know Abra Dresdale. She does regenerative design, actually. And so I was in a breakout with some coworkers, and at the very last minute of this very short breakout, somebody put something in the chat that they were really having trouble in our department, like feeling not safe, and then poof, it ended, and we were all like floored. Like, what did they mean? What did we do? And that person's courage, and to use a mechanistic term, they kind of threw a wrench into the system, and we reacted. And long story short, we've now started these really nice departmental meetings that we call meaningful, healthy differences. And we're just like really slowly like ironing out, like what's gone wrong? What can we do better? How can we support each other? And it's really slow and it's really lovely. And we are like slowly shifting the culture in our little department and hope to like fractally, spread that. So I just thought I'd share that as a good example.
Ah, it's a wonderful example. Thank you for sharing that. And that's an inspiration to all of us, because that is what we would call a regenerative response, right? So it was thoughtful, it was intentional, it was thoughtful of the individual and the whole, and patient. One of the things that I find is in a mechanistic system, we can force things because we're controlling all the parts. In a living system, nothing's forced. It's got to be nurtured. And so thank you for sharing that. And just as you said, the courage to go down that path.
Yeah, thank you very much, Madeline. Appreciate it a lot. There's some other questions coming in the chat. I'm just going to read through them one by one, starting with John's comment. Thanks, John. He says, it's such a different perspective. How do you connect to business people who operate in a very traditional mindset? Great question.
Well, that's a great question. And one of the things that I've had lots of conversations with some executives of large organizations, Fortune 1000, employing thousands and thousands of people. And one of the things that's important to them is they recognize the current system, even though they're using it, is broken. It is not resilient. They're trying to figure out how to mitigate risk. And they're double downing on the machine paradigm, but that is what's happening. And the other thing that they are recognizing as a part of that is there is disengagement. And a new generation, the millennials coming in, are not going to embrace just being told what to do in jobs that do not give them life. And so they're recognizing they can't keep doing it this way, that it actually, from a financial standpoint, is actually costing them money. And that's the thing that is important to recognize, is right now the current system is benefiting a few. It's not benefiting the whole. And what can we do? And it truly is broken. So what can we do to continue to support those who want to make that transition, and recognize it takes time and a lot of work to be able to do that. But there is a financial proposition for the change.
Actually, on a related note, Marieke asked a question, what to do with fundings which ask for traditional mechanic systems while you want to move to the natural regenerative organization?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so the thing that I tend to encourage people to do is to just reframe it. So if you want to know those outcomes, let's put it, so what we'll say is, hey, those outcomes fit here in the framework. So they're natural recurring outcomes. So what we want to do is say, so what conditions do we need to create to allow for those outcomes to come in a natural way versus a forced way or a degenerative way that extracts from people. And so it's not that we don't want the outcomes, we just want the outcomes to come in and with health, not at the expense of health. And so what we do is say, it's not that it's that we don't talk about those things. It's just, it needs to be done in the context of health as a means to be able to design around.
Awesome. Thanks, Marieke. Others, anyone else? Reflections, questions, comments?
Yeah, and back to that original question, is there any shifts that's happened to you that you want to share, or things that you'll take away from you today that says, hey, this is something I want to put to work?
I'll share again.
Please.
Well, yeah, so like I said, we're trying to be change makers at my library. And one of the things that even the leadership council of the whole sick place has been talking about, we need a culture of compassion. And I heard about this in my little department meeting. I was like, oh, great. How are we going to do that? Like, why don't we start our own brainstorm? Like, well, wait, let me go back to the council and ask them, like, everything just takes so long. So like some of us are just like, let's just do it ourselves. Let's just start, make a list, start doing the thing. Don't ask for permission. We're not doing anything wrong. We're just going to be like, here, we did it already. We started it, instead of waiting for their next bi-monthly meeting. And so I'm a real advocate of just like, take it on yourself, just start things moving. So this was good, because what I want to say is those frameworks I want to share with my people back at work. Thank you.
Awesome. You'll all get these PowerPoints so that you can use them in whatever form you'd like, and a lot of other free resources that you can have to be able to start you on that journey. And we really advocate for this idea of self-organizing. So, please run with it. Continue to create the conditions that make what is happening with you and your team and your in your area that you have the relationships with healthy. And I promise that will influence others. And I do believe there is a effect that happens as you begin to see the shifts that's happening in how people are thinking about things and how they're behaving, and then how that gets translated into the practices. And, you'll find real influence and how it shows up. I'll share one example of a colleague who's close to us, who, when all the downsizing happened because of COVID, decided that they were not going to participate in the maintaining of their salary while everybody else's salaries were reduced, and actually went to his boss and volunteered that if everybody else is going to reduce their salary, I'll take mine as a reduction as well. And that interaction that was self-organizing went all the way up to the CEO of the firm, and they decided that was going to have to be embraced by everyone. And so that's just an example of when there are a lot of things that I think out of just that empathetic and livingness that was all a part of us that we just need to be attuned to and recognize that when some things are happening, we need to embrace it because we're a part of it. And that there should be an empathetic approach that allows for that in a way that is in service to and actually recognizes it's in service to us at the same time. So thank you.
That's an interesting story, Trey, because it kind of reminds me a little bit of Madeline's story where she said someone shared, that this is broken, and that triggered all of this change. And similarly, that's what happened in the organization you just described. And it's kind of amazing that one voice, just this one thing can create all this change. And so I think sometimes it's tempting in big organizations to think, my voice doesn't matter, but you never know, it does, I think is the point. But we have a couple of other questions. Another one from John. Thanks, John. I'd love to know who might be an advocate, globally known leadership who would stand up for this perspectives, enables others to gravitate towards a powerful perspective.
So I'm assuming, John, you're talking about just to use the term, like a known brand, someone that would, when they speak, it would influence this kind of perspective. There's some of those people are starting to show up and I've got deep roots in the regenerative agriculture space, and that's what's informed a lot of this work. And there are some really strong advocates that are showing up that are being voices for soil and are actually beginning to talk about. We're seeing some people that are doing that from a place of influence. And so I think that's a great example of what we can do to influence some of that conversation. But we're seeing that across a lot of the movie industry where some of those voices are starting to show up. You're seeing it in some of those who advocate for the environment as a way to consider that. And so everybody I see some of them from, Alan Savory at Holistic Management, which is a mentor of mine. And a lot of this work has come out of, as well as Nicole Master for the Love of the Soil. There's a great organization called Kiss the Ground that's advocating for this. And what we're saying is we want to advocate for regeneration in the soil. And we talk about soil, souls, and society. So we want to see it advocated across all of those things. And so we're trying to influence that perspective within all of those other aspects of society that we know needs to change. And I mentioned the Capital Institute and John Fullerton. He's bringing out this idea of regenerative economies as a way to bring that kind of conversation to play. And there are a few really incredible books out, from Carol Sanford's Regenerative Business to Reinventing Organizations, that are thinking about and really pushing the envelope on the consciousness of what it means to embrace a different way to manage ourselves in these social connected relationships.
We're actually even seeing it in the tourism industry. There was an article recently in the New York Times about regenerative tourism, which was quite interesting. Awesome questions, you all. There's another really powerful question from Katie. Katie cites a quote that says, "The success of the intervention depends on the interior condition of the intervener. Your guidance on elevating your interior condition." Trey, Alex, others. It's a great question.
Yeah, incredible question, Katie. We talk about nested systems and say that all of this begins with you. So as you begin to see the mindsets that need to shift in you and the behaviors that you need to change and your own practices change, it influences the people around you. And we see that on a team. We see that in a family. We see that in a larger organization. We see that in us. As we're advisors and resources for organizations making these shifts, this has to be important to us as a way to be able to live into this, not just talk about it and conceptualize a new way of seeing things. It's actually living it out. So for us, it really is about designing our lives in a way that enhances the health of our own being as a way to live into our own potential. And it requires a lot of work. And so we've put out things like what we call as our Genius Workbook for people who are wanting to deeply dive into their own uniqueness and what can we do to support them in that. And what we call the informational cycle, where we're asking people to be disturbed a little bit around this idea of reimagining how they're seeing themselves using the birth, growth, death, and decay cycles of life as a ways to help us imagine something different. And so we say to ourselves, what needs to die that will create the conditions for something to come to life? That for us is key things that we apply to ourselves and to the work that we do together.
Thanks, Trey. I posted a link in the chat. Our mini workbooks currently live on our blog. They're totally free, and they have some incredible questions that could just begin those shifts or continue the shifts that have already begun today. So hopefully those will be resources you find useful. We have a couple of minutes left if anyone has anything else they want to share. Trey, I think your video froze, but we could still see your face.
Okay, all right.
Luckily,
great.
it's a good image. Don't worry, you look just very stoic.
Okay.
Oh, you're back. You're back.
Okay, good.
Awesome, Ethan. Thanks for sharing your nonprofit. Others are welcome to do the same if they like their organization.
Yeah, Nora Bateson is awesome. So great work.
Great. Well, just a couple closing thoughts on our side. We're obviously available by email. You have our email address if you have any other questions or reflections after this webinar closes. But we wanted to extend the invitation to you all if you'd like to join us, if you're interested in learning more about this approach, even just beyond the workbooks we've already shared. We do have a Foundations of Regenerative Organizations online course coming up. It's a 2-session online course. It's in 2 weeks, and we wanted to offer you all that opportunity. We'll share more in an email, but we wanted to offer, if you sign up in the next couple of days, we'll also throw in a free regenerative fitness challenge. Our next one coming up is all about potential and releasing the potential within yourself and discovering what's unique about you, kind of building on that unique Genius mini workbook. So we'll share more about that in an email if you're interested. If not, we have tons of other free resources available on our website. And also just always available if you all want to reach out and have a conversation. We would love to learn more about each of you and discover how we can further support you on your journey. So with that, Trey, any other closing thoughts?
Well, just blessings to you all in your journey in this process. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions, but thank you for being here today.
Yeah, thank you very much for taking the time out of your day. I know lots of us are spending a lot of time on Zoom, so just grateful that you all decided to spend some time with us. So have a great day and stay safe, everyone, and healthy. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.